All right, welcome to Roots of Reality Experiences. I'm joined by Dr. Nick Tiller, who is an exercise physiologist, award winning author, and a columnist for Skeptical Inquirer. So, Nick, thanks for coming back.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. I understand that I'm the first person to be a repeat offender on the podcast.
That's right. Yes. Congratulations. You are the winner. So
It's an honor to be back. Thanks for having me.
a lot of your research focuses on fitness pseudoscience. So I just want to dig in with that a little bit more in this episode. What are the popular fitness myths right now that you're seeing?
There are too many to count, and what I've started to notice more and more recently, as I start to explore these, I'm trying my best to keep up to date with the fitness trends, and particularly the ones for which there are really exaggerated claims. So I do a lot of Googling and checking out websites of manufacturers and things. But obviously, what that means is that my search engines and my social media posts are now the algorithms are generating this stuff because it thinks I'm interested in it. So the range of ridiculous, absurd pseudosciences that I'm seeing on my social media feed, for example, I couldn't even begin to explain them all to you. Any product that you can possibly think of that is based on some kind of loose, sciencey sounding mechanism, whether it's some kind of device that you stick up your nose to help your breathing, a supplement with all sorts of ridiculous claims, or it could be an ice bath or a some kind of hypoxic chamber. You name it, and it's being advertised to me on a daily basis.
Wow. Okay. So basically, I'm a little disappointed because it sounds like there's tons of fitness pseudoscience that remains prominent. Is there anything new that you haven't seen before that you've been starting to see within the last year or so? Or
some of the trends that I'm seeing more and more now, and again, it's a little bit biased because I see most of this stuff on social media, and of course, your social media feed is curated by your previous viewing history. So it's hard to know if this is an authentic trend or if it's just trending on my timeline. But there are two things that have really become popular again. So that one of them is ice bathing and ice plunging. This has been around for a long, long time, but for some reason it's particularly trendy at the moment. I don't know if there's a particular athlete or group of athletes that have been doing this, but a lot of people are talking about ice bathing, not just for recovery, because this has been traditionally used by athletes after a hard training session, supposedly to help reduce inflammation. It's based on the same premise that, icing an injury would help to facilitate recovery. Somewhat erroneously, that's a contentious issue in and of itself, but it's based on the same idea that cold helps to heal. But I'm also seeing the types of claims like cold plunging can help to not just reduce inflammation, but promote healing, can help to boost immunity, which is always a funny claim when you see those two things, those two mechanisms together, that something can reduce inflammation and help to boost immunity. Because if you're getting an immune response, that's a pro-inflammatory response. So I don't know the mechanism by which something could suppress inflammation and provoke inflammation at the same time. So that's
magic.
Always a red flag. Yeah, exactly. Magic. I mean, it's nonsense, isn't it? People just make these things up. The other one that I'm seeing a lot of at the moment is breathing exercises. And breathing used to be essential, and it's now fashionable.
Yes.
And again, it's very trendy at the moment. And again, not just that, there are some plausible claims surrounding deep breathing regimens, like it can help with relaxation. And we know that deep breathing in through the nose, out through the mouth, can help to regulate autonomic function to promote relaxation, and this can help to reduce blood pressure. These are all sort of more or less legitimate claims, but again, a lot of the claims are being extrapolated wildly, and we're seeing people suggest that deep breathing can again promote healing and can help to boost immune function. I saw a really a crazy one recently, which was that deep breathing can help to increase your tolerance to carbon dioxide. And they said, it was a whole website devoted to this, and they said that this is a good thing because carbon dioxide helps to suppress inflammation. And for any physiologists or physicians who are listening, they'll immediately know that this is a ridiculous claim, because CO2 has no part to play in suppressing inflammation. It's just kind of science sounding enough to fool people who maybe don't understand the area so well. But often that's all it takes, is just something that sounds sciencey, sounds like it might be a little bit technical. And often that's enough to trick people into at least trying or paying a bit of money to try the modality. So those are the two that I'm seeing quite popular at the moment.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess basically all I have to do is just sound like you know what you're talking about, and people will think you do. This
right
psychology.
That's often all that's necessary. And when you combine that with, I was having this discussion with somebody earlier about experts and how you would define an expert. These days, it's very, very difficult to do so, because a lot of the time, experts are people who have the most social media followers. I mean, they're often not legitimate experts,
right,
but people are perceived to be expert if they have a large Twitter following or they've got a lot of followers on Instagram. So having a lot of followers lends kind of a false authenticity to the individual, a false air of authority. And if they start posting about CO2 retention and its abilities to suppress inflammation, often the combination of the two things are more than enough to get this kind of message across.
Yeah, I mean, it especially seems to me that with the age of social media, anyone that becomes a celebrity online seems to drift into the world of lots of different things, whether it's talking about scientific concepts that they are not too knowledgeable about, or I see this in the field of history a lot as well. Once you get enough followers, it seems like people have opinions about lots of topics that they have done no formal study or training in. And but people listen because they have that following, and they start to think of themselves as basically experts on everything, I guess.
Well, and that they sort of have to, because most people, even if they are experts at something, they'll be an expert in a very esoteric field of study. So if you're an academic, for example, you'll be an expert, let's say a physiologist, but even within that, you're probably very knowledgeable about a particular area of, maybe it's exercise tolerance or respiratory physiology or cardiovascular. But if your thing is to promote yourself on social media, and if you're trying to promote engagement, you can't just stay in your lane. Almost, it's by necessity, you have to end up veering out of your lane to get a lot more engagement and to promote yourself more widely. So that's when, exactly as you say, you have people who maybe are legitimate experts in one area, but they end up veering out of their lane and talking about all sorts of things that perhaps they shouldn't be talking about. And they usually it goes unremarked, and they don't get into any trouble. But there are a number of people who are very prominent on social media who shall remain nameless, but they make a living for themselves by giving their opinions on all sorts of subjects.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious then, because given your expertise, when you see people that don't have any background training, they don't have, not only do they not have a PhD or a master's, but they don't even have a bachelor's degree in the topics that they claim to be experts in. Does that bother you when you see these people with millions of followers, or just like a huge following that are constantly promoting stuff that is not correct?
I do find it frustrating, only because the stuff that should be getting, or that I think should be getting the traction on social media, for example, tends not to. And it's the legitimate experts. Very rarely do legitimate experts get the following. So this has been studied, not so much in sort of the US and in Europe, but there are some studies showing that if you look at the relationship between academic qualifications, for example, and the number of followers that a particular influencer has, it's an inverse relationship. So the more followers they have, the fewer educational qualifications they have generally. And I think that's probably by virtue of the fact that if somebody has social media as their thing, let's say they are a full-time science communicator or a full-time influencer, they generally don't have the time to do anything else. Right? This is one of several reasons why I don't have my own podcast, because I don't have the time to devote to. I mean, you know better than anyone. It takes a lot of time, a lot of resources to put into that, and I just don't have the time to do it. And when you see very accomplished academics, for example, the really top men and women in their field, they don't usually have even social media accounts because they don't have time to manage the social. They don't have time to generate content, and because they're too busy doing real science. So that's something that I constantly struggle with, and but I've sort of given up on expecting social media to do the right thing. You know, I'll spend 2 years, for example, collecting data and on a study, writing the study, just, you know, working hard to get it published, and it'll get, you know, a couple of hundred likes, which is pretty good for me and my account on Twitter. And then somebody will post a picture of a cookie and get 200,000 likes, or, you know, and so it's stuff like that that's frustrating. But I think you just have to let those things go over your head. You have to let those things go.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if we're, you know, trying to really nail what effect is going on right now, it's just that, you know, what drives social media engagement in many ways is just people who are really there for entertainment. And then, you know, whether they're an expert in something or not, as you said, it's basically their full-time job is just being an influencer and just posting stuff that gets attention. And unfortunately, in the world we live in today, you know, whether that information is accurate or not, it doesn't really matter. It's really about engagement. And of course, the, you know, social media algorithms don't really care either, and when it comes to accuracy of information. So if it's going to get likes and retweets or whatnot, you know, it's going to become popular. And but yeah, I mean, for any person that's working in a professional field, studying something academic in nature, hosting podcasts and being super active on social media is really challenging. And even if you are active, you're not going to get the following that someone who is a full-time influencer is going to get. You know, someone there who's just spending every day making TikTok videos or whatever, like, oh my God, who has time for that? So,
well, and there are a couple of other trends that I've noticed just in my own social media use, is that the posts that tend to get the most traction are the ones that are just inadvertently commenting on a very divisive issue.
Yeah,
because it either provokes a reaction, you know, like a contrary reaction. So people are disagreeing with it. So it gets them a little bit agitated. So they want to comment and they want to talk about it. Or it's people that agree with it. So when people fall on one side of the fence or the other, it's those divisive posts that seem to get the most traction, just from my own anecdotal experience. But we also know, you know, this has been studied, that 2018 paper that was published in Science, the spread of true and false news online. And they found that fake news spreads farther and deeper than the truth in all aspects of information. And again, that's because it's these sensationalist headlines are the ones that people want to share. And now that's a real problem, because people who are interested in the quote unquote truth and that actually are trying to be objective and want to get to the truth of a matter, they tend to follow a different set of rules than the people who are just interested in promoting engagement. You know, I'm as a scientist, I'm interested in trying to be as objective as possible, trying to minimize my biases, trying to disseminate information that is a close approximation of what we know to be the truth, or at least, you know, factual. Whereas a lot of other people are just, you know, like this person that's talking about CO2 retention suppressing inflammation, that they can just make something up and post it online, and you don't have the same barriers to disseminating information.
Yeah, you can just pretty much spit out anything, and people will listen if you sell it well enough.
Right.
And I think just
if it just strikes a chord with people, if it happens to conform to people's pre-existing beliefs, then it's going to gain some traction.
Yeah, I mean, from my experience on social media and seeing, what kind of goes viral and everything else, and even from talking to influencers, I mean, it seems like there's like three main things that really get a lot of attention on social media. It's uh, basically some type of comedic performance or some type of entertainment thing, something with sex appeal, or something that is just very divisive that gets people pissed off, or people that are like, oh, I support this, and getting people kind of yelling at each other. And unfortunately, objectivity and being sort of this low key, trying to give a balanced perspective on things is kind of boring for a lot of people, and are very sort of, we want it now, give me all the information type of world we're living in. And I remember a quote that you said last episode that I had you on, where you said that, and I think this is in the context of fitness, but I think mentally to a certain extent it's true as well, where people are kind of inherently lazy about things in life, and so it's much easier to you know uh, go to some influencer for information when they just tell you what you want to hear, or tell you some miracle or quick fix, type of thing. So
Yeah, and I wrote about this on the Skeptical Inquirer recently. I came up with my own informal logical fallacy called the quick fix fallacy. It's not sort
yeah,
of I mean, all fallacies, I guess, are made up to a certain extent, but it's just this idea that if somebody is telling you what you want to believe, what you want to hear, you're much more likely to buy into the premise. Because, and we're talking about health and wellness, but this goes for all facets of society, and that is people generally want simple solutions to complex problems. And the health and wellness industry hinges on exploiting that fallacy. And going back to what you were saying about social media engagement, it mostly comes down to evoking an emotive response from someone. So it's no coincidence that the type of posts that seem to get the most traction are either something, as we've said, that is very divisive in nature, that gets you rooting for or against a particular proposition, or it's a cat on a skateboard, or something that gives you the warm fuzzies, but isn't particularly, it's not a political perspective or anything like that, but it makes you feel good.
yeah.
So it's the two extremes of reactions, but it's either way, it's emotive, and so you seem to get the posts that are on one end of the spectrum or the other.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but the good news, I guess, is that there's still people out there that are interested in trying to dig deeper and get information. From your perspective, then, following stuff on social media and online and the trends, would you say that the influence of like fitness influencers, is that continuing to grow? Has it kind of hit its peak, or is it just kind of back and forth, hard to tell? Or
Yeah, it's hard to tell because there haven't been any objective analyses on this. We're actually trying to set up a study at the moment where we do an audit of health and wellness advice that's administered by social media fitness influencers, because I'm interested in seeing to what extent the advice that they're giving is actually supported by scientific consensus, for example, or even just trying to understand the demographics of fitness influencers, or if they give advice with or without providing any references or sources. So I'm interested in looking into that. I can only imagine that that the number of fitness influencers are growing. In trying to set up this study, for example, I've been looking at a lot of marketing websites, and there are dozens and dozens of marketing websites that are created specifically for marketing companies to help connect them with particular fitness influencers. So if you go into one of these sites, and some of them you have to pay $500 a month, because they're not meant for individuals, they're meant for large, corporations or whatever.
yeah,
And you do a keyword search for diet, exercise, health, wellness. Hundreds of thousands of fitness influencers come back, and they're all, listed. You can filter them by age, demographics, target audience, and so on and so forth. But and these are potentially hundreds of thousands of people who have self-identified as fitness influencers and have taken the time to register themselves on these platforms
Mm,
to make
okay.
it easier to, and so that says nothing about the, you know, the other hundreds of thousands of people who are not specifically looking to engage with marketing companies or advertising agencies. And what's very interesting is that you, on each one of these accounts, it tells you what the starting fee is for a sponsored post. You know, and if somebody has more than 1 million followers, you know, you're looking at $5,000, $10,000 for as a starting, as a baseline fee for a particular sponsored post. And then you look at the, you know, the other extreme, some very famous athletes. The first one that comes to mind is Cristiano Ronaldo, who's a very famous soccer player. People in Europe will certainly know who he is, maybe less so in the US.
I would hope most people in the US would know Cristiano Ronaldo, but I'm not
Yeah, well,
sure.
you'd hope so, but I don't know. Maybe I don't know how big soccer is. I guess it's quite popular, but anyway, he's got like 300 million followers
Yeah.
across all social media platforms, and on any given year, he makes somewhere between 45 and 50 million dollars exclusively through Instagram sponsorships.
Yeah.
And that's
crazy.
more than double the salary that he gets from playing soccer. So it just goes to show you just how big social media fitness influencers are, the popularity of that vocation. And you're seeing even now, this isn't, I know I'm not directly answering your question, but you're seeing now a lot of universities are now developing courses. So diplomas, for example, in becoming a fitness influencer, how to generate content, how to engage with followers.
Yikes.
Whereas
That's interesting.
and these things obviously never existed, you know, a decade ago, even a few years ago.
Yeah.
So I think that speaks to the inherent popularity of social media fitness influencers, and I can only see that it's going to grow from here.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose also like to a certain extent, why is there such a huge demand for fitness influencers is also partly due to the rise in obesity rates and health issues related to weight in general. And so that supply and demand factor is I guess is pretty big as well.
Well, there's a couple of things there. The first one, kind of speaking more broadly, is that we've been moving for a long time, for several decades, we've been moving away from long form text. So people read books and magazines less and less,
Hmm.
and we read short form text more and more. So that might be blog posts, very short online articles, or social media, Instagram posts and Twitter,
Yeah.
and 280 characters. And so our attention is being constantly divided, and it's this ever more sort of reductionist approach to information gathering. So that's the first thing, is that these platforms are constantly vying for constantly diminished attention span. So that's the first thing. So we're using social media more and more, and particularly young people. Again, this has been studied. They get most of their news and entertainment from their favorite social media platforms. The other thing is that it aligns with what we call fitspiration, which it's not a very good portmanteau, but anyway, so it's inspiration and fitness combined. And it's this idea that people will use social media and particularly follow their favorite social media fitness influencers to get inspiration about training and to get training advice and dietary advice. So they're getting more and more of their information regarding those areas from social media. So the combination of the two things, it's inevitable that there's going to be greater demand for fitness influencers.
Yeah, it seems like that's not going away anytime soon. And yeah, so.
No, I don't think so.
Well, then, I suppose we could talk basically all day about all the different fitness myths being promoted on social media, but what are the best science-based exercise practices, that anyone could do?
Yeah. Okay, so that's a good question, and I get this quite a lot, and it's not an easy one to answer, because essentially what we have to do as a society is just get better at critical thinking, and be better skeptics. And that's not something, we don't have these skills ingrained. It's not like we can just fall back on our internal wiring to know what's true and what's false, because we spoke about this in the last time that we recorded together. Humans evolve logic and reason for navigating hypersocial groups and for being able to recognize patterns in the environment. Whereas when the human and pre-human genome was being naturally selected, those things were really important for survival. But modern society has changed dramatically. Even in the last 30, 40, 50 years since the internet and social media, our genes and our environment are now incongruent. And we don't have the inherent critical faculties to be able to distinguish information from misinformation, science from pseudoscience. There's too much. We're trying to process too much data that we have available every day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, literally available at our fingertips on our smartphones. So the point is, we don't have these skills ingrained, and unfortunately, there isn't enough of an emphasis on critical thinking and skepticism in our educational institutions. So primary, secondary, or further education is really focused on teaching people a trade, teaching people skills that they need to go on to have a successful career. But there is very little emphasis on critical thinking, which really, I've said this before and I'll say it again, is just, we have a fundamental duty, a responsibility to be clear thinkers and to make good decisions if we want to contribute to a civilized society, because we're all in this together. We've all got a vote. We all get a say on, a certain degree on public health policy, for example. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown how some people were able to follow basic instructions about getting vaccines and wearing face masks, and others weren't. And so the ability to think critically and make informed decisions affects everyone on a day-to-day basis. So to answer your question, a degree of directed self-study is needed.
Yeah.
Fortunately, there are lots of resources that are available, and these are the kind of resources that I used, because I'm pretty much a self-taught skeptic. Firstly, you need to get better at reading. I've said already that we've been moving away from reading long-form text, and I imagine a lot of the people that are listening to this are probably avid readers anyway. But we need to get better at reading books. So Carl Sagan's Demon Haunted World, for example, is one of the most influential skeptical books that I can think of. Anything by James Randi, Michael Shermer, Why People Believe Weird Things, Ben Goldacre's Bad Science. These are all kind of fundamental texts in critical thinking and skepticism. You can look at magazines like the Skeptical Inquirer, which is the magazine for science and reason, which I write for on a monthly basis. The Skeptic magazine, Free Inquiry. Go and look at online lectures by people like Stephen Novella, Susan Blackmore, Stephen Jay Gould. They'll teach you what it means to be a skeptic and a critical thinker. Listen to podcasts. Ones like this are great because it's wonderful that you're giving people like myself who think of themselves as skeptics, critical thinkers, a platform to discuss good ideas. Others are the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, Body of Evidence podcast, Geologic, not to promote your opposition too much.
Yeah, I don't really have. I'm not sure. Yeah, you can promote anyone you want.
Okay,
I don't think of any opposition. That's okay. It's a peaceful podcast.
Good. All right, I appreciate that. Go and look at online debates. Any debate that pits theology against secularism often offers lucid examples of good and bad logical construct, and have these kinds of discussions with your friends and colleagues. Is a good way to identify if you have any internal biases and that kind of thing. So these skills are not developed overnight. It's not, if you wanted to learn to play a musical instrument or learn a new language, you can't just decide to speak fluent Portuguese and wake up the next day and be able to do it. You have to put in time and dedication to learn these skills and refine them. But I honestly believe that being a clear thinker and being able to make good decisions, these are some of the most important skills that you'll ever learn, and you'll be able to apply them not just in health and wellness, which is my area of expertise, but across the board. Being a good thinker is being able to evaluate evidence and data and distinguish information from misinformation across all facets of society. So we have to learn these skills for ourselves, because nobody else is going to do it for us. Critical thinking is not for other people, it is for us.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, yeah, I think that makes total sense. Now, thinking in mind of like people who they're like, you know what, Nick, I'm not going to be able to read anything because I'm not a reader. I don't read books. If someone says that and they're like, I'm going to the gym tomorrow, and I want to become a fitter person in general. Perhaps the right question then isn't, what exercises they should do, but rather, how can they prevent injuries maybe or something when exercising? What would you say are the most common mistakes people make when exercising? Because I feel like for a lot of people, when they go to the gym, they're going there with the right mindset. But I imagine that for a lot of people, if they're not in the gym a lot and they go there and they get hurt, they're like, I'm never doing that again. So what would you say from your experience is kind of like basic tips for someone exercising, like this is what you should and should not do?
Yeah, okay, it's a good question. And this is something that's really pertinent because I took a long time off from going to, obviously the gyms were closed for a while during COVID, or during the most, what's the word? During the worst parts of COVID, I suppose you could say. And it's only been in the last probably 6 months, 8 months that I started going back to gyms, and I've been comfortable going to these public places. And the environment seems to have changed. It's difficult to know if that's just my perception, if my perception is biased. And being a skeptic, you've got to just, often you've got to assume that your perception doesn't necessarily reflect reality. But it seems to me that people are less focused on their training. There's people 9 times out of 10, they're spending more time on their mobile phones than they are actually exercising. They'll do a set of 10, a half-assed set of 10 reps on something,
Yeah.
and then they'll spend the next 5 minutes on their phone, on social media or texting. So I feel like there's this divided attention. So I think that's one of the mistakes that people make, is that they're not really tuning into their training, focusing on what they're doing, which means, number one, they're probably not going to get the best results. Number two, they're not focusing on their techniques. That's when you can pick up injuries and things. So that's kind of one mistake that I see people making a lot. I think another mistake is, especially if people are following a brand new training program, particularly at kind of, it's probably tapered off by now, but January, February time, you see gym memberships, spike, they go through the roof. And, 60 to 70% of those gym memberships are canceled before the end of January, right?
This is the year things change, Nick. It's
yeah,
great.
exactly. New Year's resolutions. It's like, if you haven't done it the previous 30 years, what makes you think? Sam Harris says, I listen to a lot of Sam Harris because I agree with sort of 95% of the things that he says. And he's a very clear thinker. But anyway, one of the things he says is that you are the world champion of being exactly the same person that you were yesterday. Right. So if you really want to change your habits, what makes you think that tomorrow is going to be any different to yesterday? So you can make those changes, but you've actually got to try and do something differently. It's no good just coming up with a New Year's resolution to get in shape. So another one of the problems is that people start the new year, they want to get in shape, they start going to the gym, and they don't persevere. They think that they're going to get results in 2, 3, 4 weeks, and by the end of January, they haven't got the beach body that they always wanted, so they give up. But as we were speaking about early, most of the time there are no simple solutions to complex problems, and getting fit is it's not easy. It takes an effort displacement, so you've got to put in some effort, and there's a time displacement. You've got to put in the time, and that goes for anything that in this life that is worthwhile achieving, whether it's, as I've said, learning a new language, learning a new musical instrument, learning any kind of technical skill, getting in shape, running a marathon. These things take time and effort and patience to acquire. So don't expect to achieve everything that you've ever wanted in 3 or 4 weeks, and then to give up when you haven't done it. So perseverance is key. Another one of the big ones the big mistakes that I see, and this is sort of getting more into the nuances now, is how people exercise and they train thinking that that's enough to help them to lose weight. I mean, losing weight and weight management is one of the main reasons that people start working out.
Right.
And particularly, males particularly want to build muscle, lose fat. Females, by and large, want to lose fat generally. But I'm an advocate for men and women weight training regardless, because I think it's very good for you for building strength and so forth. But let's say you were previously completely sedentary and you were doing no exercise, and then you turn over a new leaf and you start going to the gym 3 times a week. If you're going to the gym 3 times a week, or you're working out 3 times a week when previously you were doing nothing, 3 times a week probably sounds pretty good to you. That seems reasonable. But we put that into context. Even if you go and you work out for an hour 3 times a week, which is probably the average, you might burn, let's say, if we're being generous, 500 calories per session. That's if you're doing moderate to high intensity aerobic type exercise. And people aren't doing an hour of aerobic activity. They're probably doing half an hour of aerobic activity and then 30 minutes of weight training, whatever. But let's be generous and say they're burning 500 calories per session. That's 1,500 calories per week that they're burning exclusively through exercise. You go out for a pizza, that's 2,500 calories, right? You go to the Olive Garden, one meal, 3,000 calories or more. So you've more than doubled the calories that you burn just by going out and training 3 times a week. So there's this misunderstanding that simply going to the gym or going and working out 3 times a week is going to help you achieve your health and wellness goals, particularly weight loss. And that's not the case. There's the old saying that you can't outrun a bad diet. And weight management especially is really, it's 80%, 90% getting your eating in order and figuring out how to eat healthily in a long-term sustainable way. And then if you're working out on top of that is great. And obviously exercising is important for your cardiovascular health and for your muscle strength and muscle tone and that kind of stuff. So we've got to work out as well. But so the big mistake that people make is they think that just going to the gym 3 times a week is going to be enough. And it's not. You've got to go to the gym or work out or play a sport at least 3 times a week and eat consistently well on a day-to-day basis. And then in the long term, you stand a better chance of achieving your goals. So I think those are kind of the big mistakes people make. And also following fad diets. That's another big mistake.
Yeah.
The diet industry is worth about $70 billion every year. And the profits from the diet industry are the highest they've ever been. And obesity rates are also the highest they've ever been. And they've been trending upwards for decades now. We're up to about 40% of Americans are clinically obese, 30% of Europeans. It's predicted to be 50% of Americans in the next 10 years. So what does that tell you? If profits from the diet industry are at an all-time high and obesity rates are at an all-time high, there's clearly a disconnect between those two things.
Yeah.
Whatever we're spending our money on in the diet world is not working. And it's predominantly fad diets and supplements. So people need to think about that.
Yep, that makes sense. Now, when it comes to burning calories, obviously, people should be doing both strength training and aerobic exercise, but what burns more calories, strength training or aerobic exercise like running and stuff?
Yeah, so I suppose the important question is calories of what? So I suppose by and large, people get their energy from burning fats and carbohydrates. Protein has a fairly negligible role in energy metabolism. So if you work at a high intensity, you're going to burn more carbohydrates. If you work at a lower intensity, you're probably going to burn more fats. The optimum intensity for burning fat, which is called the fat max, is usually about 60 to 70% of heart rate max. To answer your question, you will burn more calories by doing moderate to high intensity aerobic type training most of the time. Now, if you're a serious bodybuilder or a serious weightlifter, you can burn a lot of calories from weightlifting because you're doing high intensity efforts, you're lifting a lot of weight and you're doing a lot of sets. Most people on the average gym goer is not doing that kind of work in the gym. They're not bodybuilders, they're not burning thousands of calories a day. So for them, they're better off doing more aerobic type exercise. Having said that, muscle strengthening exercises are super important.
Yeah.
And even, the recommended activity guidelines that are agreed upon by all major organizations, World Health Organization, American Heart Association, American College of Sports Medicine, is to engage in about 300 minutes, between 150 and 300 minutes of moderate to vigorous intensity exercise, and to do two strength training exercise sessions per week. And that's because it's important for mobility, it's important for general whole body strength, particularly as we age. So I'm a firm advocate of not sticking to one or the other. And there's, for some reason, there's this ongoing argument about what's better, whether it's weight training or aerobic activities. They're good for different things. Right? Doing a lot of weight training is not particularly good for your cardiovascular health, right? But sitting on a bike 3-4 times a week is, maybe good for leg strength, but it's not good for whole body strength or general mobility or, flexibility and that kind of stuff. It's not going to help your upper body particularly. So doing a combination of both types of exercise training programs will be important.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it seems like people tend to lean on one or the other for personal preference. Maybe they just don't like doing the other one. But yeah, it seems to be a common problem.
Well, and aerobic exercise is perceived to be quite boring because it's like standing, walking and running on a treadmill, sitting on a bike. It is quite boring. But that's the most important thing about exercising, is to do something that you enjoy. Because if you don't enjoy it, you're not going to keep doing it. And the biggest problem that we have is not getting people to exercise, it's getting people to continue exercising. Because most people have done some exercise at some point in their life, but not enough people are continuing to do that exercise. So we've got to do whatever we can to increase adherence rates. And that will come from enjoyment. If you enjoy the exercise, you'll continue doing it. So if you hate going to the gym, don't go to the gym. Find something else. If you enjoy running, great. If you don't enjoy running, find a different sport. Maybe you enjoy going to spin class because you're surrounded by other people and you enjoy the community aspect. Maybe it's yoga. Maybe you enjoy playing sport. Join a soccer club, join a netball club, join a hockey club, play basketball. Doesn't matter. You start doing martial arts. Do boxing, play tennis. Doesn't matter. Find something that you enjoy doing, and then if your adherence rates go up, that's the most important thing, is continuing to do it. Because if you don't enjoy it, what's the point?
Not sustainable.
Sooner or later, it's not sustainable. Exactly. It's the same, and that comes back to fad diets as well. Fad diets help people to lose weight for about 2 months, and then people get sick of eating a certain way, and they fall off the wagon. As soon as you conceive the very notion of a wagon, you're going to fall off it, because this idea of restricting yourself to certain food groups and eliminating others, it's just a matter of time before you break those sort of those things that are not ingrained, that are not habits. So you've got to find a way that you can eat healthily in a long-term sustainable way. Following a diet doesn't help. Research is very clear on this. People that follow fad diets, they lose a lot of weight in a very short period of time. But if you look at 6-month, 1 year, 2 year follow-ups, people regain all of the weight that they've initially lost. 30% of people regain even more weight than they've lost. Then they go on another fad diet. They lose the weight, they fall off the wagon, they regain the weight, and we get this what we call weight cycling or yo-yo dieting, which is actually causes a lot more harm to cardiovascular health than not following any diet at all. So you're much better off following a diet, not following a diet, but following an eating regimen that you can sustain in the long term, so that you don't get this constant increase and decrease in body weight, what we call yo-yo dieting, because that's not good for you either. Yeah,
that's definitely not ideal to go back and forth like that. Probably hard on the body to continue to adjust.
It's hard on the body. It's bad for your cardiovascular health, particularly in women. and it causes all sorts of psychopathologies, binge eating, depression, poor life dissatisfaction, and it causes you to lose heart because you try this diet, you commit yourself, you try very hard, the diet fails. And then that happens over and over again. There's only a certain number of times that people are going to be willing to make those kinds of sacrifices. And then they wonder why they're not achieving their long-term weight loss targets or the long-term health and wellness goals, because they're not investing the time in something that is long-term sustainable.
Yeah. Yeah, makes sense. Now, I guess the next thing I'm curious about then is, are there any exercises people should avoid doing or should be extra careful with? Because I mean, I feel like when I'm reading up on sort of exercise, everyone wants to research some type of exercise they could build a regime if they're going to work out consistently. And so, like, for example, I've heard people debate about like, oh, should you do sit-ups and crunches? Is that bad for the back? Other exercises, perhaps like that as well, or maybe like when you're using free weights, there's a much higher risk of injury. What are your thoughts on that?
I think generally with any kind of exercise, there's a low risk of injury, assuming two things. Number one, you focus on good technique and good posture. If you're lifting weights and you're not holding your posture and not holding your core effectively, or you're not cognizant of the fact that your form and your technique will change as your muscles start to fatigue, then that increases the risk of injury. But that's the same if you're running or on the elliptical or whatever. You've got to pay attention to your technique and make sure that that's appropriate. So that's the first thing. I think the other thing is ensuring that it's great to be enthusiastic and it's great to be passionate about wanting to work out, but you've got to allow your body time to adapt to the new stress. Ultimately, when you work out, you're putting a strain on your body, and acutely, what you're effectively doing is damaging your muscles. Everybody knows the feeling, or most people know the feeling, waking up the next day after they've worked out for the first time in a while and the muscles are very, very sore. It's what we call DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness. And what you've effectively done is introduced micro tears in the muscle. You've literally got very, very small, tiny tears in the muscle, which causes soreness and inflammation, swelling in the muscle. And acutely, you've damaged the muscle. And it's only when the muscle starts to recover and you resynthesize these structural and functional proteins and you allow the body time to adapt, that you actually get fitter and stronger. You don't get fitter and stronger by training or exercising. It's recovering from training and exercising that helps you to improve and adapt. So a lot of the time people are very enthusiastic and maybe they overdo it, or they go and lift, a 20-pound dumbbell in one session, and then the next session they jump up to a 30-pound dumbbell, without allowing these very, very small increments in the middle. Or they start running, and either they start running because they know that it's good for them, but they're carrying much too much body weight and they're putting a lot of force through the joints of the lower body, when really, maybe they should start off by walking or jogging or doing some non-weight bearing activities like cycling, elliptical, swimming to lose the body weight first before running. Or they'll start running and they'll run 10K in a week, and then the next week they'll double it to 20K. Well, you can't just double the stress on your body and expect it not to kick up a fuss. The general rule when people are running is, and I use running as an example, and this is a bit of an old school rule, but it seems to stand the test of time, is to not increase your mileage by any more than about 10% in a given week. That's a very small increment. So if you're only running 10 kilometers a week, or let's say 10 miles a week, then the next week you should not increase it by more than 1 mile. The next week your weekly mileage should be 11, and so and so forth. And that is because it takes your body system, your various body systems, particularly the musculoskeletal system and the tendons, time to adapt to this new strain. And if you overload the body by too much too soon, that's when you pick up injuries. That's when you suppress the immune system and you pick up infections. And let's be honest, if the exercise is so intense that you wake up the next day and you can't move, you can't get out of bed, not only can you not, you can't train for a week anyway. You probably don't want to because you're in so much pain, but you're hobbling around for the next week, and you kind of end up shooting yourself in the foot. So yeah, making sure your technique is good and allowing your body time to adapt. Those are two really important bits of advice.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So it's really less about what exercise you're doing and more if you're just doing that exercise properly or not.
Yeah, and that is even more important if you're doing free weights, or if you're doing weightlifting, because the risk of injury is higher if your technique isn't so good. So we know that doing squats and deadlifts and things like this are good for building whole body strength. There are two caveats there. Number one, your technique's got to be good. So get somebody who knows what they're doing to check your technique. Don't think that you can just go to the gym and start lifting heavy weights without any kind of guidance. You wouldn't get behind the wheel of a car without having some kind of guidance.
Hopefully not.
Yeah, well, hopefully not. Most people don't. Obviously, the consequences of doing that are a little bit more severe. At least in the gym, if you're lifting correctly, you're probably only going to harm yourself. Although we've seen horror videos on Instagram of people injuring themselves and others because they forgot to put the collars on the bars, for example. But the point is, speak to a professional, speak to somebody who knows how to lift and can advise you on technique so you don't injure yourself. And the other thing that I think it's worth touching on is, I was always told that everybody should be squatting and everybody should be deadlifting. And by and large, most people can squat and deadlift as long as their technique is good. But I found out the hard way that actually I've got a degenerative condition in my lower back, in my lower spine, that about something like 8 to 10% of the population have. And I spoke to my consultant, who's an orthopedic surgeon, and he said, because of your back condition, actually your back's fine, but you shouldn't be squatting. You shouldn't be loading up the spine from behind your neck. You shouldn't really be doing deadlifting, because you're putting your spine in a kind of a weak position because of your degenerative condition in your lower spine. So actually, don't back squat and don't deadlift. Now, most people can probably get away with these things if the technique is good, but I was always told by people who understood strength conditioning a lot better than I did at the time, that everybody should be weight training. Everybody can squat and deadlift, and if it's causing you discomfort, it's because your technique is wrong. Whereas actually, there are probably a small number of people who, from a biomechanics perspective, shouldn't be doing these exercises. So it just comes back to speak to a professional before you start doing some serious weight training, and just make sure you've got some professional advice. That kind of goes without saying, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I suppose that, if someone isn't comfortable trying to, lift weights, there's other ways you can get strength training, whether it's like push-ups or pull-ups, things that you're not risking holding something, but rather it's just you're, lifting up your body. Or I guess you could do crunches or sit-ups or something like that as well.
Well, and you know what, the general advice is for people who are just sort of getting into weight training, it's always a good idea to do at least 4 to 6 weeks of just very basic strength exercises. So that can be done, as you say, using your body weight, or it can be done in machines. Machines with benches on them, so they support your back, they support your posture to a certain extent. They take you through the range of motion that you need to follow. Now, okay, we don't want to do those necessarily exclusively because they're not very functional, but it depends what you're training for. And if you're just starting to get into working out, then there's absolutely nothing wrong with using machines to begin with, just to build some basic strength before you go on to some more advanced stuff. You asked me earlier about some of the mistakes that people make, and I see this an awful lot of the time, is that people will start a new training program, and then within 2 weeks they're doing single leg squats, holding dumbbells while they're standing on like a wobble board that's challenging their posture. And I bet you any money that if you took that person aside and got them to do just a standard two-legged squat without any weight, their technique probably wouldn't be very good. They'd have strength imbalances. They'd be, wonky. Their hips would be dipping to one side. And this is a perfect example of, you need to walk before you can run, or you need to crawl before you can walk, before you can run. So, let's start with the basics. See if you can squat with body weight first. Then you can gradually load up the weight. Then you can, if you want to, go onto one leg. Then introduce the wobble board if you absolutely have to. But don't jump in at the deep end. You need to learn these basic skills. That goes for everything, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I would probably just go out on a limb and just say that I imagine that a lot of people, if not most people in the gym, probably don't know much about technique when they're doing exercises, but are just going, well, I saw this on TV or something. I saw other people
Right.
doing this. I can do it. Looks easy.
And I never want to be the guy that starts correcting other people on their technique. I see particularly young guys who are in there, they're doing deadlifts because they've seen on some YouTube channel that you need to do heavy deadlifts in order to build muscle, and particularly male teenagers or young adults, they're keen to build muscle and to get beach bodies and whatever.
Yep.
They're just of that age, right? That's why they're training. And so they're doing these heavy deadlifts, and their technique is awful. And I'm thinking, you're gonna get injured if you keep doing that. I don't want to be that guy that goes around and starts telling people how to do, how to train. So more than a couple of times, I've had a very polite word with the trainer who's working there, and I've said, listen, maybe those guys over there want some advice, want some pointers on how to lift. And more often than not, they're like, thanks for bringing that to my attention. That I appreciate it, and I agree with you. And so that way, they get the advice, and you don't have to be the guy to go and step in and correct them.
Yeah.
But getting your technique right is important.
Yeah, I mean, I try to always be pretty risk adverse because I've never quite felt comfortable, messing around with lots of different weight equipment, especially equipment I've not been trained on or anything like that. And so I typically I like to be pretty old fashioned when I go to the gym or something, and just do like lots of I like pull ups, like push ups, like things I feel like I can control more easily than lifting stuff, especially because I feel like it's also a challenge for people to know like how much is too much weight for me to be lifting. And I feel like there's kind of this obsession with also trying to change your body's kind of natural build. Obviously, lots of young men, especially, want to build lots of muscle, and I feel like when you're trying to put on lots of muscle, that's a great way to get injured in the gym or something like that. I also wonder, does it increase your chances of injury if you're, changing your body's kind of natural build?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I certainly think that while I'm certainly an advocate for going beyond your perceived limitations and pushing beyond your plateaus and always pushing to go harder, I don't know, people might disagree. This is my opinion. And particularly as I've gotten older, I think it's good to, when it comes to performance and ability, it's good to know what your natural inclinations are, and perhaps if you have a certain ceiling. So I'm not so much a young man anymore. I'm 40 now, and I've been training a long time, and I know what I can and can't do. And I know that I have a body mass range of about 15 pounds. So when I'm at my lightest, I'm at the bottom end of that range. When at my heaviest, I put on 15 pounds, mostly of muscle, and I will never be able to put on more muscle, regardless of what I do, regardless of what I eat or how I train. That is my upper limit for putting on muscle mass. And I always remember when I was younger, I've been a martial artist all my life, and I was obsessed, as most martial artists are, with Bruce Lee. It was like my hero. I think Enter the Dragon was one of the first martial arts movie, one of the first movies I ever saw, and I was obsessed with it. And I spent most of my adolescence wanting to look like Bruce Lee. And I was, doing everything I could to, I wanted to be shredded. I wanted to have the low body fat, and I wanted to be able to kick really high. And it wasn't until I got to about the age of 25 that I realized, well, hang on, I'm not a 5'4" Chinese man, first of all, right? I don't have his genetics. I don't have his inherent skills. I'm not a full-time athlete. I'm built differently, right? And that's okay. Let's just make the most of my genetics. My genetics are predisposing me to certain skills. And it's the same when we talk about elite sport. I don't care how hard you train or how well you eat or how well you want it in your head. If you don't have the genetics to be an elite athlete, you're not going to be an elite athlete. Sorry. It's just that's life, right?
Yeah.
And some people have the genetics to be an elite athlete and don't have the will. They have the genetics and maybe they have the skill, but they don't have the will. And the best athletes in the world have everything. They have the psychology and they have the training and the nutrition and they have the good genetics as well. So I think, yes, I'm an advocate for understanding what tools you have and then making the absolute most and fulfilling your potential. That's what sport is for me, is just fulfill your own potential. Don't worry about necessarily competing with other people around you.
Yeah.
That's something you only learn as you get a little bit older, I think.
Yeah, that seems like a balanced, common sense approach. And of course, you could also always tell yourself if you think you did have the genetics, like, well, I was focused on other things. I didn't really want to be an athlete. So,
right, exactly. Yeah, I just didn't want it enough.
yeah.
And and a lot of people have there are strategies you can follow to overcome your genetic limitations, particularly in the gym. Taking steroids is one of them. I would never advocate taking steroids because it's incredibly bad for you. They really work, but they'll also screw you up. They'll screw up your cardiovascular health, increase your risk of certain diseases, screw up your blood lipid profile, and so forth. But this is why athletes dope, because they have reached a ceiling in their training, in their performance, in their genetic predisposition. So they turn to doping in order to surpass their inherent limitations.
Yeah. I suppose another aspect I was thinking about when it comes to people wanting to exercise, especially if they're always trying to push their limits, but maybe even going overboard at some points, is it ever problematic, for example, when it comes to your longevity as an athlete, to for example, if you put on lots of muscle, how sustainable is that over time? Because I see athletes, for example, that go from being a professional athlete to then putting on tons of weight after they retire, and they're not maintaining that obvious fitness level that they did when they were an athlete training every day. So it makes me think almost psychologically, maybe it's good to be more balanced about how much you work out and how much weight you're trying to put on in terms of muscle, because it may not be sustainable later, and that may break down sort of your psychology as an athlete and make it harder for you to continue to work out. I'm not sure, but just throwing out there about what your thoughts would be.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I think a lot of people, again, but particularly in the early phase of their training life, they end up fighting their own bodies because, again, they don't know what they're inherently capable of achieving. So their body is kind of naturally wanting to regress to a certain, regress to a mean, and you're constantly fighting against your body. Now, I think that's good to a certain extent, because I don't think we should just be comfortable with just letting ourselves go and getting out of shape. The perfect example is, as you age, it is harder to stay in shape. You're naturally going to retain more body fat, and your metabolic rate does start to slow down. There is a very clear, almost linear correlation between age and I guess it's a negative correlation between age and metabolic rate. Your metabolic rate, the number of calories you burn on a day-to-day basis, will decrease as you age. So it is harder to stay in shape, and you're not going to recover as quickly as you get older. But you've got to sort of, to a certain extent, you've got to work against that. You've got to work not just harder, but you've got to work smarter as well. And that's where the experience comes in. But and again, I can only speak from my own perspective. I know that for me to be very, very lean, I can get down to sort of 6 to 8% body fat, but I can't sustain it because my body just is not comfortable there. I have to really starve myself, which is no good. It's like, well, what's the point? And only when I've been doing very, very high mileage training as part of preparation for ultra marathon, that I've ever been down at sort of 6 or 8%. And that's just because my training mileage was through the roof. But it's not really sustainable, exactly as you say. And just as I've been researching more and more in the field of ultra endurance sport, and we've published a bunch of studies in this area now, is that actually doing these sort of extreme exercise behaviors may not be particularly good for you in the long term.
And like
So
the
you
heart.
mentioned, yeah, mostly cardiovascular system, and there might be. It's hard to know if there's sort of any long-term impact on the renal system, on the kidneys, and this kind of thing. But it's mostly the cardiovascular system it's quite malleable with training. So we know that as we do endurance training, we get all of these favorable adaptations in the cardiovascular system that help us to perform, and it improves our cardiovascular health. But if you're doing really extreme exercise, and if you are periodically going out and exercising in an ultra marathon for 24 hours, 30 hours, 48 hours, and you're doing that periodically throughout, 2-3 times a year, after a certain number of years of training and competing, these things might manifest in some people as sort of cardiovascular pathologies, myocardial fibrosis, which is scarring of the cardiac tissue, cardiac arrhythmias, right ventricle dysfunction. It's still an emerging area of research, but I think we can say with some confidence that doing extreme exercise for long periods of time, for over many years, is probably not very good for you. So again, that just goes back to your point of pushing your body beyond what it's probably naturally comfortable doing is probably going to have consequences, and it's going to affect your longevity in the sport. Having said that, doing that kind of exercise is better than doing nothing. But there's probably a lot of green zone in the middle.
Yeah. Now thinking about like as you age and fitness as you age, I'm 28 now, and so now I kind of look at myself like, okay, I'm kind of in the area where a few more years from now I'll probably start declining in terms of my athletic ability, which is disappointing, of course. But I always heard, growing up, like, oh, as you get older, you have to stretch more and you have to warm up more before you exercise. How true is that? Is it absolutely necessary to stretch or warm up before running or lifting, or does it not make a big difference, or does it depend on how much you're doing of an exercise? Or
yeah, I'll answer that in a sec. If I may, I just want to go back and follow up on something that you mentioned about as you get older.
Yeah.
And your performance declines. And by and large, I guess it does, but there are exceptions to that rule. Number one is if you're a sprinter, you're going to reach your peak in probably your early to mid 20s, most people. And by the time you get to your late 20s, early 30s, your career as a sprinter usually is sort of coming to an end. That's if you're at the highest level.
So late 20s, you said?
I don't know the exact literature, but I think sort of early to mid 20s, you're probably going to be in your best sprinting shape, but certainly at the elite level.
Okay. Just wondering about my career as a sprinter.
You're sorry,
gone.
Yeah, I think your best days are behind you. But in endurance sports, we see this all the time, is that like in marathon running, for example, we see middle and long distance runners do 1,500 meters when they're, in their early 20s, mid 20s. And as they get older, they gradually transition to 5K, 10K, and then up to marathon. And the best 1,500 meter runners will often make the best marathon runners as they get into their sort of early to mid 30s, because the physiology of 1,500 meters and marathon running is actually fairly similar in terms of the demands on the aerobic system. And in ultra marathon, the really extreme distance stuff, the age of peak performance is somewhere between 35 and 50.
Wow.
And the really long races, we're talking about 100-mile single stage races, most of the champions are in their 40s. So it's not necessarily a rule that as you get older, your performance declines. And actually, as I said, I'm 40 now, and I'm in better shape now than I was when I was 21, and I'm running faster marathons, and I'm stronger, and I've got more muscle mass. So it doesn't necessarily have to be that as you get older, your performance declines. Obviously, there will come a point where the age will catch up with you, but it's not an inevitability. Let's put it that way.
That's interesting. So that makes me think, because when I think of athletic performance, I'm always thinking of kind of the five major sports in the US or whatever, like hockey, soccer, basketball, American football. And I suppose a lot of that due to why athletes retire in their late 30s or early 40s is probably because of the inability to sprint as much as they used to, I guess, is probably, from what it sounds like, is the endurance level should be about the same. But of course, I guess maybe do they lose strength at that age as
Well,
well?
it's because they're performing at the highest level, and the
Yeah.
competition obviously at that level is much more extreme. So sure, if you want to obtain peak performance, but in like team sports, pro football, pro soccer, NBA, whatever, then you're going to have athletes who are going to reach their peak in the probably somewhere in their 20s or early 30s, and by the time they reach their mid 30s, they're thinking about retiring. You see the same thing in MMA. I'm a big fan of MMA, and fighters usually when they hit their 30s, they're thinking about, okay, what happens now, and by the time they're mid 30s, they're winding down their careers, and very rarely do you see athletes fighting into their 40s, although it does happen. So to perform at the elite level is kind of a different story. I think the exception is probably the long endurance sports like marathon and ultra marathon. You can still perform at the elite level in your mid 30s in marathon, and certainly in ultra marathon, and that is because, as you say, you can retain endurance much more easily, and you can lose some of your strength and some of your sprint ability, but these and some of your maximal capacities. But these things just aren't as important in really long duration exercise as they are in the shorter stuff. And certainly in sports like marathon and ultra marathon or any kind of ultra distance sport, experience is really important as well.
Yeah.
Knowing your body, knowing what your the optimum nutritional approaches, knowing how to hydrate yourself. So knowledge is really important in those kinds of sports as well. So actually, age and experience can be a virtue.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. So I guess then trailing back a little bit, then when it comes to like stretching or warming up, how
Right.
necessary is that then as you age?
So it used to be thought that everybody should be doing lots of static stretching. So that's when you get into a position where you're stretching the muscle and you hold the stretch for,
Yeah.
15, 20, 30 seconds. And probably doing static stretching isn't that important. I think there's enough literature now suggesting that doing a static stretch isn't important. And in some cases, it may actually inhibit performance.
Okay.
Probably doing more dynamic stretches where you're taking the muscle and the joint through its normal range of motion. This is probably good as part of as a general warm up anyway, just to increase joint range of motion before exercise. I've got into the habit of doing static stretching after exercise. Whether
Okay.
it's necessary or not, I don't know, but I find that if I do a hard running session, then but by the end of the session, my muscles, particularly if they're starting to fatigue, which is often the case, they start to tighten up. I find that doing some static stretching can help relieve some of the tension. I don't think it's necessarily important for performance, but just so I don't have to deal with the discomfort of tight knotted muscles, I find that static stretching is good for me. But certainly dynamic stretching before, static stretching after is probably a standardized approach.
Okay. So dynamic stretching examples would be like jogging in place or something, or like high knees or leg kicks.
Yeah,
or
I'm
something like
thinking probably more like doing standing squats, lunges, that kind of
that. Okay.
stuff. Coming up on your toes to get your calves moving.
Yeah.
The whole point of a dynamic stretch is to take the muscle and joint through its normal range of motion, and you incorporate that into a low intensity aerobic kind of warm up. And the whole point of a warm up is to increase the muscle temperature. And it can take 10, 15 minutes to increase muscle temperature to the point where it's the whole point is, of course, to not just to optimize performance, but minimize the risk of injury. So doing some low intensity aerobic exercise and doing some dynamic stretches as well is probably important for minimizing injury risk. Having said that, if you're doing predominantly weight training, those things are not necessarily as important, but you still need to do some kind of warm up. So whether it's a warm up set where you take you're taking the muscle through the normal range of motion. Let's say you're doing a bench press. You still want to take the muscle and joint through a normal range of motion as you're going to do in the bench exercise. But you do it on a very, very light weight, and you do a high number of reps because you want to warm up the muscle. You want to warm up the tendons. You don't just want to throw all the weight on the bar and then start lifting.
Let's go.
Exactly. Yeah, just go from 0 to 60, in a split second, because that's a surefire way to get injured. And I've seen, big, strong professional rugby players throw out their shoulders or drop weights on themselves and their colleagues because they didn't warm up properly, or because they were lifting too much, or they didn't have a spotter. So if it can happen to a professional sports person, it can happen to your average gym user as well. So don't think you're above the warm up.
Sure.
That stuff's important.
So like the science of getting injured, that process is what, like your muscles stiff and it just tears or something? Or
yeah, exactly. The whole point is to, as I said, to increase muscle temperature. That makes the muscle more supple, increasing blood flow because blood delivers oxygen and nutrients and these kinds of things. For aerobic work, you're activating aerobic enzymes and so forth. And so you've got to condition the body to be able to sustain the rigors of high intensity exercise. So if you're just going out and you're doing a very low intensity effort, let's say you're going to go and do a 60-minute jog or sit on the bike for 60 minutes, it's probably less important to take yourself through a warm up, because you can pretty much just start. You're not going from 0 to 100 miles per hour. But if you're going to do anything high intensity, if you're going to be lifting weights, if you're going to be doing sprints, you've got to allow your body time to warm up and get into the kind of the optimal zone, not just for performance, but for reducing injury risk.
Would you need to warm up as well for like doing a push up or some other more casual strength training exercise? I guess like I've even heard, I think the US military was considering not having people do crunches or sit-ups due to people getting back injuries. What do you need to do warm-ups for that type of stuff as well, or for any exercise in general? Or
I'd say it comes down to individual variability. Some people, but particularly if they're young and they're not injury prone, can probably jump into those things relatively unconcerned. Other people need to take their time. I'd always err on the side of caution and always just take yourself through a light warm up anyway, just to reduce the risk of injury. But you'll get to know yourself, and don't forget as well that doing a push up for most active people would be considered a low intensity effort. I do push ups now to warm up for heavier exercises, whereas for some people, push ups are the heavy exercises.
Sure.
In which case, you don't just want to jump into a push up. You might want to do some light push ups on a wall at an angle, or you might want to do push-ups from your knees to begin with, just to warm up the chest, the muscles, and the chest and shoulders, back of the arms. So it's going to be different for each individual person.
Yeah. So I guess just kind of listen to your body and go at your own pace.
Listen to your body, go at your own pace. And the whole point is that if you're weight training, you're doing warm-up sets. They should be light and they should be easy. And they should be a high number of repetitions, and then you can gradually increase the resistance until you're into your training weights, and it's the same principle for any kind of aerobic work. So regardless of what level you're at, it's not a good idea just to go from rest to working out. You've got to try and bridge that gap somehow.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. When it comes to burning calories as you age, does it get harder as you age to burn calories, or does, something like coming back from an injury or having less body mass, these things impact the amount of calories that you can burn?
Yeah, typically we know that there's sort of a standardized formula that we can use to estimate how many calories an individual is burning during any particular exercise, and it doesn't necessarily get harder to do that as you age. The reason that it's difficult perhaps to facilitate weight management as we get older is, like I said, your general metabolic rate starts to slow down, and most people are not very good at changing their diets congruent to that.
To
So we're
match it.
eating
Okay.
this, yeah, right. So we're eating the same foods, and we're sort of doing the same activities, and we're not cognizant of the fact that on a day-to-day basis, we spend most of our days sitting, working on our laptops, or working. Most people have relatively sedentary jobs, and the number of calories that you're burning just on a day-to-day basis is actually dropping as you get older, and yet we don't change our exercise habits, and we're not changing our diets either. So that's why it seems to be more difficult to evoke long-term weight management as we get older. Certainly, coming back from injuries can be a little bit tougher as you get older, and we get more injury prone generally as we get older as well. Body is not as quick to react, and we just don't recover as effectively. Most people can attest to the fact that they could do things when they were younger that they can't do when they're older. Just
Hard to deal with. Yeah.
Exactly, and I find that again, just from my own experience, and this is why I think it's very important that as somebody that advocates exercise training and good eating, that I do these things myself, because I can empathize with people who are then trying to do it. I know that once I get going, I can be just as fit and I can train just as well. And as I said, I'm fitter and stronger than I've ever been. But going from a standing start just takes me a lot longer to get up to speed. And now I used to be like a Porsche. I could just put my foot on the gas and go.
Yeah.
And now
Yeah.
I'm like a steam engine. I've got to stoke the fire and shovel coal, and you get this slow kind of chugging of the engine. And it takes me a long time to get up to speed. Once I get going, then I can go. But it takes me a lot longer to get there. And I think that's sort of the common experience as you age. Some people might be listening and they're like, Nick, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm still in great shape. But most of the time, my perception is that as you get older, it takes a little bit longer, especially bouncing back from injury.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely true, and I also feel like, I mean, you talk about you're the best shape in your life, and you're 40. I mean, I feel like it's that also kind of build up of knowledge. Like a lot of people don't really understand what's the best way to work out or find that consistency until they're in their 40s. I know my dad's been a big lifelong runner, and runs a lot of 5K races. In his 40s, he was beating lots of 20-year-olds in 5K races, and I mean, today he's now 70 and he runs like 3 or 5 miles several times a week. And it's like with your age, it's amazing how long people can continue to be fit and do things, but it does take longer to get warmed up and ready to go. Yeah.
Well, and this is the thing, I ran my first marathon when I was 18 years old, and it was a wreck. It was a car crash. It was, I got round and I finished it, and I think I did it in like 3 hours, 46 minutes or something. But I got my nutrition wrong. I was hyperglycemic, so I had low blood sugar.
Oh, gosh.
I don't remember the second half of the race. I got picked up these awful shin problems because I didn't have the right running sneakers. And probably for the first 3 or 4 marathons I did, I had kind of similar experiences. And I thought that's just what running a marathon was. And little did I know that I was just really just doing it all wrong, just relying on enthusiasm and youth. And I was, running marathons at sort of 3:30, 3:40, not fulfilling my potential and having a tough time as well, really fighting against my body. And then as I started doing more of them, now I've wrapped up probably getting close to 50 marathons and ultra marathons, probably more ultra marathons than marathons. And I know exactly how to train for these things now. I know how to pace my threshold sessions to get the optimal physiological adaptations and how to progress them over time. I know how to pace my long sessions. I know how to avoid overtraining. I know how to avoid injury. Whereas early on, I was picking up all sorts of injuries. Now I know how to I know what sneakers I need to wear. I know how to train in the gym to correct my strength imbalances. I know that if I go for long periods of time without doing certain leg strengthening exercises, I start to pick up injuries. So I know exactly what I need to do. My nutrition is on point. And, I know I'm running marathons of like 3:15, 3:20, which is considerably faster than I ever used to do it. And I'm feeling good when I finish. I don't know that I'll ever run a sub 3 hour marathon. I don't think I have the genetics. I'm probably a little bit too heavy, but I'm running close to as fast as I think I can. And that's all come with age and with time. And so I'm training now. I think I still have the same enthusiasm, but I'm training hard, not just hard, but I'm training smart as well.
Yeah.
And that's come not just with age, but I've learned, this is what I do. I've read the papers and I've written the programs, and I've worked with other people to write programs. And I know exactly how I need to change my training, manipulate my diet to get certain outcomes. And that comes with age and with experience. And so I think that's now why, if I could take what I know now and put it in the body I had when I was in my early 20s, then I think probably a lot of people would say the same. That would be an interesting scenario.
Yeah. So you could always say, if I could have been a professional athlete.
Yeah. Could have been, maybe. I still maintain that if I'd have dedicated myself to mixed martial arts, I think probably I could have. I like to think I could have done that at a professional level.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a tough sport, but I was too distracted when I was younger, and I got into running when I was sort of, as I said, like 18, 19, and distance running and mixed martial arts don't really go very well together. So
it's true, a little bit of opposite,
yeah, for
type
sure.
of things. But but that is honestly though, that is, I think, realistic, because it's very hard to know what our potential was in a sport, if we didn't dedicate that time. But of course, lots of us have different things that we're interested in. We're not necessarily interested in becoming a professional athlete in that sport or not. But I think it is fair to say that there's, probably lots of people that could have become professional athletes but never did, because they didn't put the time or effort into doing it, because they just weren't interested enough. So,
well, I used to work with a chap who was in his earlier life was quite overweight, significantly overweight, I think borderline obese. I've seen pictures of him from long ago. Looks like a different person. And he went through a phase of just really wanted to lose weight and get in shape. Was never an athlete or anything like that. Didn't have an athletic pedigree in the family. And then he lost the weight, really became slim, and got into running once he'd lost the weight, and found that he was an exceptional runner, not quite elite, but borderline elite. He could run a 10K in sort of 32, 33 minutes, which is very, very fast.
Yeah.
And we know now, from the literature, that some people are born with larger cardiovascular capacities, larger lung capacities, greater blood volume than other people. Some people have more hemoglobin than others. And these are the components of the blood that actually transport oxygen to the muscles. So they've actually got inherently, they've got a greater oxygen carrying capacity than other people. There's just individual variability. Just like some people are taller, some people are shorter, some people, are broader, some people are going to have bigger hearts, some people have bigger lungs, so on and so forth. And it so happened that he had these genetics to be a very, very strong distance runner. And he almost went through his whole life without realizing any of those talents, just because he was overweight and wasn't interested in exercising. And it's interesting to think how many people maybe have the genetics to be a supreme athlete and just never realize those genetics, because it's just not something that they're interested in. And you could say that for anything. Some people are naturally probably exceptional at languages. Some people could, brilliant musicians, but just have never had the inclination to pick up a guitar and give it a go. That's why it's important just to, try different things and see what you can pick up.
Yeah, I think that's
some dormant skills.
Yeah, pretty good advice. And I think, inspiring for people, like, hey, it's not too late to do something. It's your life, it's short, make the most of it and try those things.
Everybody's going to be good at something. When some people are going to be supreme athletes and some people are not. Some people are going to be amazing at languages. Some people are going to be wonderful writers or scientists. Some people will be, wonderful. They might have wonderful people skills. Everybody's got something that they're going to excel at. And I guess part of growing up and figuring out who you are is to figure out where your skills are and what it is that you might excel at. And part of the fun is trying to figure that out, right? Trying different things.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Nick, I mean, I think we did a pretty good job of carrying over from last time and then building up on it about, not only what is sort of the things that are pseudoscientific in the fitness world, but just basic stuff about what people should know, because I feel like that's just as important. It's not just you know more than just what's wrong, but also what's right. Um, and so, yeah, thanks again for sharing your expertise. Now, what are you currently working on? What's on the radar ahead in your future?
Well, as always, I'm juggling loads of different projects. We've got a couple of very interesting manuscripts that are about to be published. One looking at commercial respiratory interventions, which, depending on when this airs, it should be online pretty much about the same time. We've got an editorial that's being published in the International Journal of Sports Nutrition and Exercise Metabolism that I've written with Professor Stu Phillips, and that's all about how to be a good skeptic, not a cynic, but being a good skeptic, which is obviously in line with what we spoke about earlier in the previous episode. I am working on a book that is going to make up part of a series called What Science Says. Now, this book series has been commissioned by Columbia Press. It's being headed by a wonderful, tenacious lady called Natalia Pasternak, who's a wonderful scientist and skeptic. She's a professor at Columbia, and she's coordinated a bunch of authors to contribute different titles in this series, What Science Says. We're talking about homeopathy, physics, climate change, all these different areas. And I'm going to be writing a short book on what science says about exercise and health. And it's very much in line with what we've been talking about today: exercise myths, health myths, diet, exercise, training, and sort of how to navigate this very commercial health and wellness industry. And of course, I write my monthly column for Skeptical Inquirer magazine, and you can find out all about my work and all the stuff that I've got in the pipeline from my website. If I can give that a quick plug, that's www.nbtiller.com. So you can find out all about my work over there.
Yes, and social media, people can find you there as well.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at nbtiller, and Instagram as well, same handle. And I tweet fairly regularly about science, exercise, health, critical thinking, skepticism, whatever happens to be on my mind that particular day. So reach out to me on social media.
Yeah, I've seen that you've recently been posting sort of history related stuff, which I thought was cool.
Yeah, I've become more and more interested in sort of the history of pseudoscience.
Yeah,
and all of these devices, because what I'm seeing really is that these ridiculous devices, a lot of which were conceived in the sort of 1800s, that were very pseudoscientific. They were pseudoscientific then. Even we didn't have the
right.
scientific understanding and the technologies that we have available now. But even back then, they were pretty much based on snake oil.
Yep.
And a lot of the products and devices that we're getting nowadays, they're based on the same concepts, like electrical muscle stimulators and magnetic bracelets, magnetic. The one I tweeted out earlier today was I think it was like a magnetic, a magnetized corset, which can help to, like stimulate blood flow, and all has all these kinds of claims. Yep. And we see these things advertised now by different companies, and it's just pseudoscience doesn't change. And that's the thing: science progresses and changes. It's always updating with new evidence, and pseudoscience kind of just stays the same. Superstition never changes. It's forever going to be stuck in the dark ages. So I've been becoming more and more interested in sort of the history of pseudoscience and snake oil, because it really does help to highlight how far we've come as supposedly the rational species, the rational animal, and how pseudoscience is really stuck in the dark ages.
Yep, we're pretty good at regurgitating the same crappy advice over and over again when it comes to pseudoscience. So as a species,
exactly,
we struggle. But
yeah,
awesome. Well, Nick, thanks again for coming on, and I really appreciate it.
No, it's my pleasure. That was a lot of fun. I'll be back for number 3. We'll do the hat trick sometime, maybe.
Absolutely.